Strange New Worlds Episode Review. I would like the review to go now. Welcome, one and all. We're back again this week with Star Trek Strange New Worlds, Season 2, Episode 6, this one entitled Lost in Translation. Consider this your final chance to get out before we crack into spoilers. All right, on with the show. So as I mentioned, we're up to Episode 6 of the second season. That means there are now more episodes behind us this season than we have to look forward to going forth. And one thing I do want to touch on, with all the strikes happening right now, we're probably not going to see Season 3 for a long, long time. And while that's basically a negative because of all the reasons they're striking in the first place, and we're not going to have things on our screen for a while, the one plus side, a very cloudy bright side, if you will, is they do now have the ability to take all of the feedback from fans and I guess even haters and possibly apply that to Season 3. They weren't able to make those changes after Season 1 because they were almost done filming Season 2 while Season 1 was airing. So it will be nice for them to maybe make any course corrections that they deem necessary from the feedback they've received. Okay, so on with the episode. As I said, Lost in Translation, an Uhura episode, and basically the first time we've spent any real time with the actual Strange New Worlds in-universe version of Kirk. We've seen him a couple times in the show, twice as different alternate universe versions, and this is the first time we've seen him not on screen because he was on a pad briefly at the end of episode 3, but actually interacting in person with our characters. Is this an alternate timeline? Is it not? Whatever. In my opinion, if it's an alternate timeline or an altered timeline, it all comes down to the same thing, because you can't just change one event within a timeline and not affect anything else. So that in essence makes the Strange New Worlds universe we're currently in not necessarily 100% compliant with the original series universe. That being said, you can do things that are very similar, but possibly have interactions happen differently, different choices. You can meet the Gorn earlier, Kirk can meet Spock earlier, whatever. You're not exactly beholden to the canon that came before, but you can still play around in the broad strokes of it, and I personally like that because now we don't have to necessarily fit everything into a small box. However, we're still in that larger box of Star Trek, so I think it might be the best choice they could have gone with. Okay, rant on that over, because that's not what this episode is about. This episode is about, I guess, fear, loss, a new life form, and in my opinion, this is the most Star Trek feeling episode we've seen this season. I know a lot of people went out of their way to say episode 4, I think it was, Among the Lotus Eaters, felt the most Star Trek, and while it did have all of the Star Trek themes, it was cobbling together, I always say, like 5 different good Star Trek themes and putting in pieces of about 10 different Star Trek episodes. None of it gelled for me. None of it came together in a fun, coherent story. And this episode right here gelled very well for me. The A story was very significant, and even the underlying parts of that story really kind of kicked into higher gear for me. The B story, or maybe it's even the C story of trying to repair the station, was not quite as interesting to me. The back and forth between Una and Pelia was okay. I mean, it was nice to see Pelia actually doing something, because we've not seen her much this season and she's supposed to be a new main character. But it was nice to see her, and it was nice to see Una, even though I didn't necessarily care for their interaction. Having this episode named Lost in Translation may have been a poor choice on their part, at least in my opinion, because seeing that name come in as the title led me down all these paths of preconceived notions about what could be happening, and that possibly allowed me to put all the clues together way, way, way sooner than they intended, because this episode did have a good mystery building around what was actually happening, but by having that in the title, right from the outset, it seemed pretty obvious that this whole thing was going to be an alien life form attempting communication with us, and it was going to be a different type of communication that we had to unravel and we had to figure out by the end of the episode. Coupling that with the fact that it was happening to Uhura, the communications officer, the one with all this well-versed knowledge and history with linguistics and everything, that just kind of jumped out as being the number one primary thing behind the mystery. I know they threw in a lot of stuff about the Gorn being on the border and that upcoming war potentially, so that added a little bit of intrigue, making it seem like maybe this is a trap or maybe they're the ones presenting the sabotage. But it wasn't really enough to drag us off course too much. The saboteur turned out to be somebody else on the station, a Ramon, who was dealing with a similar situation to Uhura, who was hearing these sounds, dealing with these auditory and visual hallucinations, which was originally chalked up to be deuterium poisoning. However, it turned out it was actually something else. But, and I do really like the way they linked this. They linked Sam Kirk and his whole xenobiology thing to the fact that these life forms were extra-dimensional or ultra-dimensional. I'm not entirely sure how they presented them, but they were life forms from another dimension that were poking forth into our dimension, and it was allowing them to bind their consciousnesses to molecules within our universe, something along those lines. So they were bonding to the deuterium that was inside this nebula, this stellar nursery, I actually think it was called. And they were existing in some sort of coupling with our universe by binding to the deuterium. So by experiencing the deuterium poisoning, I think that also allowed them to bond to Uhura in her neural network or whatever you want to call it. That was a good explanation where they didn't just sit down, stare at the camera, and tell you exactly how it was influencing Uhura. They gave us, the audience, a little bit of wiggle room to try and make that connection ourselves. Unless, of course, I missed a scene where they blatantly explained it, which is highly possible because I only watched this once. But if that is the case, I really like the fact that they allowed us a little bit of intelligence instead of explaining things. I complained a little bit in the courtroom episode where they have this trope in sci-fi shows. I complained a little bit in the courtroom episode earlier this season, this trope in shows going on right now, where they will show flashbacks to something that happened 8 minutes earlier in the episode because apparently they think we're kind of too stupid to retain information. I don't like that trope. So to have us actually work through an episode here, retain the information, and put it together ourselves with more clues, that's something I really like, and that's something that made this feel better and will actually lend this episode to a slight amount of rewatchability down the line, where I feel a lot of Strange New World episodes don't necessarily have a rewatchability factor. So it was really a good episode for Uhura. I liked it here. I liked seeing the horror elements a little bit. She got to fight herself. She had a couple of hallucinations with Zombie Hemmer. I'll get back to that later. And she had flashbacks / dreams to the death of her parents, the crashed shuttle, that little bit of trauma that we dealt with a little bit in season 1, but haven't touched upon really in season 2 at all. It was pretty obvious that all of the things she was seeing was related to death. There was a connection to Hemmer, who had died. There was a connection to her parents who died. So it was nice to see these things linked in such a coherent way. I could see them kind of just throwing in random hallucinations for the sake of it, but to have them all on a similar theme and tied together, and to actually all be related to death, related to suffering around death, the end of life, it was just a nice touch. They didn't throw in a random weird hallucination just for the sake of it. And that's another I guess, sticking point I have sometimes, where they don't mesh what's going on with the overall storyline. They throw things in just for the sake of a shock moment or just for the sake of a cool scene, but everything really kind of tied together. So I mentioned I get back to Hemmer a little bit. We got Bruce Horak back here as Hemmer in a couple different ways. Mostly they were showing recorded footage from a time prior to his death, somewhere in season 1. He was tired of Uhura constantly asking for help realigning the communications array or something, so he finally taught her how to do it himself, and they recorded the instructions, kind of like a YouTube instruction video or something. That was nice. That's a nice way to keep his memory alive if they want to go back down that route. Now, that does not excuse them killing him off in the first place. I understand they want to kill him off. I understand that they wanted to provide these emotional through lines with it. But in my estimation, we didn't have enough time spent with him to make it really feel earned. If they were to have him on through season 1 and kill him off at the end of season 2, going into season 3, I feel like this would have worked a heck of a lot better. But because they offed him after actually really seeing him maybe 3 full episodes and a couple minor times, It just felt like they were killing someone off before we had a real chance to spend any time with the one true alien character on board the show. I won't spend too much time on that because I've raved about it too much in the past. Pelia, as I said in this episode, got a little bit more to do, but it was mostly a double act with Una because we find out that they are butting heads a little bit, and then again, slightly disingenuously, we find out that the real reason for this is because Una is feeling rage, guilt, I don't know what you want to call it. She's feeling some sort of way because Hemmer died and Pelia is replacing Hemmer. And I can't really fathom that sense of grief and that sense of loss and that sense of replacement because we got to see almost no real interaction between Hemmer and the rest of the crew aside from Uhura in season 1. So again, something that would have felt a little bit more genuine had they provided us more opportunities to learn and grow and get to know Hemmer, because now most of what we're trying to apply to the scene is off-screen type of stuff. We also got, as I said, a lot of interaction with the Prime version of Kirk. I think a lot of people are having problems with this version of Kirk. He doesn't necessarily seem or feel like William Shatner's version of Kirk, but I found no real faults with him. He didn't necessarily act in a captain capacity here because he was only the recently promoted first officer of the Farragut here. But what he did provide and what he did prevent seemed like a relatively good interpretation of who Kirk should be. He was intelligent. He was willing to go out of his way to help somebody. We got to see his interactions with Sam Kirk alive for probably the first time we've ever actually seen in Star Trek, and that was great. And the fact that they actually tied in Sam Kirk to having a role in the storyline, as minor as his actual screen time turned out to be, was great, because up until now he's kind of just been the Guy Fleegman punchline of the series. So to have him here actually contributing to the final situation and the final reconciliation of what's happening was great. And especially in an episode where we had his brother, James T. Kirk, to see them actually sort of kind of work together was nice, because we do know what happens to Sam, unless of course history has been altered through episode 3 enough so that he doesn't die. We'll have to see how that works out. We also see here the first meeting between Uhura and Kirk, and at the very end of the episode, Spock. So we get to see that trilogy of characters that go on to serve under Kirk later on. Oh, I also forgot to mention, we got a little bit with Pike here. He was promoted to fleet captain because he was commanding both the Enterprise, the Farragut, the station, and as we see later, even though they didn't really reference it, there were several other ships docked at this Stellar Nursery facility. So I'm not entirely sure how many ships were in the area that he was in charge of, but it's cool. I like that whole concept, and I really, really like the extra little badge he had for being a fleet captain. I hope we get to see more of that later, because we do know he becomes a fleet captain permanently, at least in the menagerie. So I always tended to think that a fleet captain was more just if there is a concerted effort, a mission going on that contained more than one vessel that had a captain on each vessel. The fleet captain was just the supreme commander of the mission, not necessarily an ongoing rank forever. The grand explanation of what was going on was a very fun Star Trek thing. As I mentioned a little bit before, these are extra-dimensional aliens that didn't necessarily share consciousness in the same manner as us. They were trying to reach out and let us know that by mining the deuterium that they were bonded with, we were torturing them, we were killing them, we were interfering with their existence, and we needed to stop. So it was a nice, plausible sci-fi Star Trek-y type situation. Of course, Uhura, being the one that was infected with their deuterium poisoning, was able to figure it out well, because she is the one capable of being able to deal with the linguistics of the situation. And I have to say here that the actual alien plot and the alien intelligences, whatever you want to describe them as, was well done in my opinion. I liked the mystery of the episode. I liked how they attempted to explain things. They provided a secondary look at what happens to people that have bonded with these aliens if they aren't able to figure things out. So we see somebody that is interacting with these beings, but they aren't as capable as Uhura because they don't have the linguistics knowledge of her, and they weren't able to cobble together a plan or a reasonable explanation, and eventually it ate away at their brain to the point where they clinically probably were going insane. So it was nice to see that there but for the grace of God go I situation for Uhura, and to have her use her innate skills, her innate abilities of being a linguist was a good touch. It was a nice use of her skills, and it wasn't just putting her forward in the episode because they wanted to make an Uhura episode. They actually utilized her as a character using the skills that she would have. I did like the little brief interaction we got between La'an and Kirk. I'm sure they're going to play that up more later on, but it was a nice little callback to that trauma she was feeling from a couple episodes ago. Still not sure where they're heading with this in the long run. I still personally think we might be seeing alternate Kirk again being rescued by the temporal agents. We'll have to see on that one. And overall, there were just some nice little touches that they didn't have to do. For instance, there was a scene where Uhura ordered the ship to fire, and there was that brief interaction where Pike, behind her back, nodded at La'an, and La'an fired after getting permission from the captain. Those are just nice little touches that I appreciate. And there were just a couple other scenes like that in this episode that just made it seem like a coherent universe instead of having things seeming out of character or out of place in a quasi-military vessel like that. Still a little odd to hear them all using the first names, especially hearing them use Nyota so much. I have to imagine that's kind of a catch-up thing because they never established her name until... I don't even think they established it until the 2009 movie, at least in Alpha Canon, but I digress once again. I think overall this episode is starting to creep up the overall feelings of this season for me. I was starting to feel like this season was going to fall a little short of season 1, and it still remains to be seen where we go for the next few episodes, but as of right now, I think that I'm about 50-50 on this season, and this is probably going to turn out to be my favorite episode, depending on the next 4. I personally thought that Kirk in this episode was relatively well done. I thought that the inclusion of Hemmer, even though it's not my personal favorite way to include him, was better than a slight cameo, which is what I heard it was going to be. So I do like seeing him again, and I hope we get a little bit more with him later. Next episode is the long-awaited Lower Decks crossover, and that could be great, or it could be a huge swing and a miss. I don't know how to feel about it. I can't wait to see it. I can't wait to see what everyone thinks about it, for better or for worse. So next week is going to be a banger of a week for all of us. But leave all your thoughts below. What are you thinking of Strange New Worlds? Have you bowed out? Are you still giving it a chance? Are you enjoying it? Are you liking these characters, or is it just way too much for you? Leave all your thoughts down below. While you're there, like, share, subscribe, throw me $3,000 or no dollars at all, possibly anything in between. But until next time,
stand easy. We're here to rescue you.
Did he say we?
That's right. I have Coombs with me.
Why, look, everybody! He's got Coombs with him!